the poll lead that the Labour Party have had, 18 points in Savanta's latest, and we're on the slimmer end. I think it's been so consistent now. It's really hard to see what Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party can do to really reverse that at this stage.
You're going into this with what, 5,685 councillors in total? How many will you have by Monday?
Well, Matt, at the end of the day, none of us know the answer to that question. I'm certainly going to reserve my judgments until Sunday when, as you say, there's going to be a large amount of results over the course from now to the weekend, where different results being announced at different times. But ultimately, let's be frank, the Conservative Party is aware we are the party of government of 14 years. We have a very high watermark to defend, which independent experts like John Curtis have explained, with the fact that we were coming out of a second COVID lockdown. We had the vaccine boost, around 60% of the country received their first jab. And of course, in recent times, we've had the particular pressures on the global economy, partly from COVID, but also from Ukraine, where we had the illegal war from Vladimir Putin, which has spiked energy prices. So we're not blind to the challenges, but ultimately, let's wait and see what the results are and have a much clearer picture by Sunday.
Yeah, you're talking about 2021 when these same areas were up for election. You gained 235 seats then. Do you think you'd be doing better tonight if Boris Johnson was still the leader of the Tories?
Well, let's be clear about what Rishi Sunak has done as a job as Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak was the Prime Minister who was then Chancellor, who made sure that people received 80% of their salary to effectively stay at home so we could protect their lives as well as the NHS. He was also the man that kept many small and medium-sized businesses going with COVID grants, particularly on our high streets, as well as helping many businesses like ceramics and being able to get energy support through the...
Jonathan, we've gone from Boris Johnson to ceramics. I know it's very important, Jonathan. Would you be doing better tonight in these elections if Boris Johnson was still leader?
Well, Matt, I'm not treating this as a laughing matter. I'm treating this as a very serious thing.
Well, answer my question then.
My ceramic manufacturers really care about this furlough, save their businesses.
No, I know. And Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister who introduced that, Jonathan. So I'm asking, it's a straightforward yes or no, Jonathan. Would you be doing better now if Boris Johnson was Prime Minister?
I mean, what you're trying to do is compare 2021 to 2024, and they're not comparable times at the end of the day, because in 2021, we were in a global pandemic. We had just had a vaccine boost, which, as I say, independent experts themselves have explained, led to a big boost for us in the polls. And obviously, we outperformed what we were expected to do in that particular time, whereas in 2024, we're now living with the global repercussions of having spent £500 billion to protect lives and livelihoods throughout the pandemic and, of course, the global energy price spike. We've now had war in Ukraine, thanks to Vladimir Putin's illegal, immoral war. We've got instability in the Middle East. You cannot compare 2021 to 2024.
Let's compare it to 2022 then, which is post-COVID, post-Russia. Liz Truss at her lowest point was on 19% for the Conservatives in YouGov's polling. And the latest YouGov poll for the Times today, the Conservatives are on 18%. Would you be doing better tonight if Liz Truss was still leader?
Well, again, Matt, you will know polls are polls. And the only poll that really matters is when it comes to election night. In a general election, the voters will have a very clear and distinct choice before them, which is they'll either want Rishi Sunak in number 10 or they'll want Sir Keir Starmer. Whereas in the moment, particularly with local elections, as Tony Blair himself said, what people tend to vote on is what their ideal government or their perfectionate government might look like, versus when it comes to a general election when they have very clear and distinct choices before them. And Rishi Sunak, as I say, is the man that has obviously taken brave and bold decisions to cancel the northern leg of HS2, to give more monies to places like Stoke to fix their broken roads and pavements, increase spending in our NHS, now around 60 billion into schools for 2024-25, up from 49 billion it was in 21-22. He's also made sure that we had levelling up funding in places like Stoke, 56 million. That's going to bring new jobs, new homes and new prosperity to our area. Townsdale funding that meant I could refurbish and reopen Kidsgrove Sports Centre. That is the reality. And most importantly, he's tackled inflation. When he came into office, it was 11.1%. It's now 3.2%. That is because of his hard work to making sure that he controls the finances whilst also cutting taxes for hardworking people, which are now going to be on average £900 a year better off.
So why do only 18% of people think he'd make the best Prime Minister?
Well, as I say, Matt, we're going through unprecedented times.
But you just told me it all sounds really good. You've just given me a big long list of why everything's all really good.
Well, actually, I've told you the reality, and the voters in my part of the world know and can see the differences that are being made in the investment that's coming into it, as well as many other places across the country. But at this moment in time, obviously, people have been feeling the pinch. We're not blind to that reality. People have been finding it very difficult. Obviously, the pandemic was incredibly hard. Then the energy price spike, which led to, obviously, inflation going up, prices going up in the supermarkets. People have had a very challenging time, and people rightly are expressing frustration, and understandably so, will lodge that in local elections like they do with any government who's in power. In 2001 and 2005, Labour suffered defeats when it came to local elections, and then they went on to win the general election. We saw in 2019 the Conservatives get 9% in the national poll. They went on to win an 80-seat majority. So you'll expect me to understand why I say that I certainly don't think the fight is over, and I look forward to that general election, and we'll go into battle making loud and clear that we have a strong record of delivery versus Labour, who have simply no plan and will take us back to high borrowing, high taxation, higher inflation, and higher interest rates.
It's a big night, Matt. It's a big night. Just for you, this, my friend. Just for you.
Well, you look very smart. I've just got my gym jams on, so it's fine. Dowell, what are you hearing?
Interesting. I mean, it's kicking off. You can sort of smell that familiar sports hall, rubbery, sort of sweaty socks smell that can mean only one thing: by-election count night. Blackpool is a fascinating place. It is one of the most iconic seaside destinations in the country. It was once a mecca for some of the most iconic performers in the world and tourists from all over the country. If you wander down the promenade here, you will still be sort of blanketed by that familiar smell of candy floss and hot dogs, and hear the rickety arcades and the clunk of the seaside fairground here. And a few streets behind, you have a very different picture. Blackpool has one of the lowest life expectancies in the country. A cocktail of social issues. So Chris Whitty released a report a few years ago saying that it was one of the most deprived local authorities in the country. A cocktail of issues of poverty and homelessness and addiction issues as well. And it is against that backdrop that this by-election takes place tonight. As you say, of course, Scott Benton, the former Tory MP here, one of the key players in Boris Johnson's path to Downing Street in 2019, resigning after a Times investigation found him to be in breach of lobbying rules. And so here we are in this sweaty sports hall. Already quite a few of the delegates arriving. The Labour delegates feeling pretty chipper, I've got to say. Chris Webb has now been for a while the odds-on favourite here in Blackpool. The sort of interesting subplot to this story is who is likely to come second. I've just been speaking to a senior member of Reform UK who is telling me tonight that he feels they have come second. Of course, we've not yet done that bit where they unfold the ballots and the counters take their notes and they get a proper picture. But he has said, just from the sense that he's got on the doorstep today from speaking to people at the polling stations, that they have done enough to beat the Tories here in Blackpool South. That's going to be the key subplot that we're keeping an eye on this evening.
John, what are you keeping your beady eye on?
Well, the only honest answer to your question, Matt, is that you shouldn't be focusing on anywhere in particular. Because the point about local elections is that they are indeed, at least in part, local elections, and you do get variation from one place to another. We certainly also get the Liberal Democrats and the Greens doing markedly better than they would in a general election. What you should be doing is looking at the local elections across the piece rather than trying to cherry pick any particular result, as I think both Labour and the Conservatives are currently trying to do at the moment, and compare what's happened in these local elections with what has happened in previous local elections. Because essentially what we get from the aggregation of all the results is an indication of whether or not the national mood has shifted, or indeed not shifted, but is essentially whether or not the evidence is consistent with that of the opinion polls. And that's basically done looking at a lot of results and comparing them with what's happened in the past. And it's a snapshot of where we are now. It is not a forecast of what might happen in 6 months' time.
Obviously, we've had an awful lot of spin and lines to take and all of that already. Should we just ignore all of that from the
basically, yes.
parties?
I mean, essentially, what surprise, surprise, Conservative and Labour are, as it were, going for the easiest possible hit. So the Labour Party are saying, gosh, we might win Blackpool South. And going on to say, well, of course, we'll forget the fact that we won this constituency from 1997 to 2019. And that if the Labour Party is going to have any chance of winning an overall majority, Blackpool South should be a home banker. What will be interesting about Blackpool South is not whether Labour win, but whether or not they can record something like the 20% swings from the Conservatives that they achieved in places like Tamworth and Wellingborough and Selby, where really big swings were needed. But it's the size of the swing that will matter, not whether or not Labour, not the simple fact that Labour are likely to win the seat. The Conservatives, surprise, surprise, are focusing on the Tees Valley and the West Midlands. And they want to say, well, look, if we hang on to those, it will go to prove that there is still life in the Conservative label and all is not lost to the general election. They, of course, conveniently forget in the West Midlands that at the same time as Andy Street manages to win their morality, the Labour Party has always managed to win the Western Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner election. And that therefore any semblance that the morality result is necessarily an indication of the popularity of the Conservative Party as opposed to the popularity of Andy Street is therefore ignored. And indeed, not only in the West Midlands, but also in the Tees Valley, some of the polling that's been done says, yeah, sure, Ben Houchen might win, Andy Street might win, but don't imagine the Conservatives would be anything like as close to that if there'd been a general election on Thursday in those two areas. So, there's cherry picking going on, which is why I said in response to your first question, ignore the cherry picking and look at the whole weight of the evidence and make sure you then say, well, how does this compare with where the parties were at in local elections in the immediate past?
John, always good to speak to you. John Curtis there, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. I know you've got a busy night ahead, so really appreciate your time. I mean, I was got a bit bamboozled there by all of the things we should and shouldn't be looking at, Kate.
Well, I think overall the message is, and it has been sort of what we've been saying throughout the night, you can't translate these over into a general election, but what you can do is look at a direction of travel and a trend. And it's why what matters is, where is Labour making gains? How big are those particular gains? Are they in the right areas? And what's happening to the Tory vote in areas where, previously we'd expected it to hold up? Things are priced in, yes, but there could still be upsets. And I think, the London mayoral race might be an interesting one.
Can I ask as well, Kate, on the idea of messaging/narrative over the next few days, because the results on all of these things are coming in at different times, literally over the next 3 days, does that determine how political parties then, cherry pick, in John Curtis's words, but then project that sort of message of, well, this result shows this, and they can hold on to that for 12 hours before the next result comes in?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of it, it's less planned and more just, that is the nature of politics, is that people always want to grasp the things that make them feel like not all is lost. And, there are some expectations which have been carefully managed. I mean, Annalisa Dodds was being really cautious around the West Midlands. And the reality is a lot of these places, they haven't even tipped the ballots out the boxes yet. There really is no actual way to know until we get to those counts. You might have gone through the doorsteps. And what you're starting to get from people who have been on the doorsteps is a sense of how strong the vote has held up, how many people have turned out, how frustrated people are. And that actually does give you a bit of a gut feeling, but we can't know until we know.
What can you read from what we've seen so far?
Yeah, very little really. Not to put a pin in everything and deflate everyone's early enthusiasm, but it reminds me a lot of a general election, frankly, and we're always hanging on these northeast seats very early on, looking at the swing, away from Labour potentially or to Labour, but I don't think there's a lot that we can tell at this stage. I think that even there's not necessarily going to be loads that we can tell even by the end of tonight. So yeah, these local elections are definitely a marathon, not a sprint, and let's wait for real judgment until sort of Saturday afternoon. But yeah, there are definitely some interesting isolated results at the minute, particularly for the Green Party, as yourself and Callum and Kate have been saying.
And when we zoom out from the individual ward results that Callum's been giving us to, what the national polls are saying, the extent to which they may or may not align with some of the votes cast on Thursday, just put into context for us how bad things look for the Conservatives.
Yeah, really bad. I don't think there's any point in kind of sugarcoating that at the minute. I think that the Conservative performance could end up being masked really by two incumbents, two very popular incumbents holding on in their mayoral races in Andy Street and Ben Houchen. I think that is probably going to be the spin, really, I guess, that the Conservative Party can put on this that might give them a little bit of gloss that otherwise isn't really there. And even if those two do hold on, the swing away from the Conservatives in those seats, seemingly, at least if the polls are anything to go by, is going to be pretty substantial. And I think what we're seeing so far in the northeast, that the Conservatives are losing the handful of council seats that they've had there. It hasn't been a great night for them so far, albeit it's very, very early days. And the poll lead that the Labour Party have had, 18 points in Savannah's latest, and we're on the slimmer end. I think it's been so consistent now. it's really hard to see what Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party can do to really reverse that at this stage.
What's your sense so far?
Yeah, and that's always the boring caveat, isn't it, Matt? Which we have to have at this point in the night. Look, we've got some interesting results in Sunderland. We're obviously seeing Reform UK do really well. We're seeing them leapfrog the Conservatives in some wards, and although it's only one city, caveat. That is a very good result for Reform UK. If I was Nigel Farage, I'd be sitting there thinking, "Oh, maybe this shows this party is real." And if I came, I could really add some rocket fuel fire to it. So I think there's something in that. We're also seeing an interesting effect just down the road in Newcastle, which is interesting, where some Green candidates are doing quite well against Labour, potentially in some of those wards that have a higher population of Muslims, perhaps linked to that conflict in Gaza. As I say, too early to read anything into that. Other wards with high Muslim majorities going to be reporting later in the night, but we could be seeing an interesting dynamic there. Overall, very early view is that it looks like Labour might be on track to do slightly better than last year, but not resoundingly better than last year.
And when it comes to the question of reform, James, and the threat that they might pose to the Conservatives, how much greater would that threat be, do you think, if Nigel Farage were to be fronting that party rather than Richard Tice?
Oh, huge. I mean, I'm sure we've all been reading the Tim Shipman book on the Theresa May years and having the PTSD that brings. But one of the moments that was when I was polling for Theresa May in Downing Street during that period, when Nigel Farage launched the Brexit Party, I did a focus group 2 days before that. And actually, most people were still planning to vote Conservative, including Leave voters. They didn't like Theresa May's deal, but they were still backing her. After Nigel Farage did one press conference, 2 days later, the focus groups and the polls, people were abandoning the Conservatives in droves for Farage. So he has this effect on the populace, especially those more engaged Leave voters who are frustrated with the direction of the government. So I think we knew this before tonight from the national polls showing Reform doing very well. I think we've got more evidence tonight so far, at least in Sunderland, that Reform UK is a real thing. And I think Farage would be a game changer for them. I really do.